Today's objective is the distributive property. Definitions. A term. A term is a number, a variable, or a product of a number and variable. So a term can either be just a basic number, like 5. It can be a variable, like x, or y, or z, or whatever letter you choose to use. Or it can be a product of a number and variable. So it can be something like 6z, okay? Because remember, product means multiplication. Constant is a term that has no variable. If we were looking at our terms up here that we had earlier, 5 would be a constant because it has no variable with it. Coefficient is the numerical factor of a term. So if I were to write 7p, 7 would be my coefficient. Like terms have exactly the same variable factors. For example, if I have 3x and 4x, when I put them together, I would have 7x because they have the same variable. They both have x, okay? Same thing over here. If you have 2xy and a negative 5xy, okay? They are both xy, so those are like terms. There's an example of 4 terms at the bottom. We have 6a squared plus 5ab minus 3b minus 12. And I've just labeled some of the terms that we've looked at. There are a total of 4 terms in this expression. 12 is a constant because it has no variable. And my coefficients are 3, 5, and 6. And this coefficient would actually be negative 3 because there's a negative sign in front of it. Okay. So for every real number a, b, and c, let's look at the distributive property. A times b plus c in parentheses is the same thing as saying ab plus ac. Okay? Basically what you have done is you have taken this number that's being multiplied on the outside and you've multiplied it by each term on the inside. Okay? Same thing would be true here, only this time you have to pay attention because there's a negative sign here. This is b minus c instead of b plus c. So you're going to multiply the outside term to each term inside the parentheses. So you would have ab minus, because of this minus sign, ac. Okay. Now it can also be written with the number being multiplied on the other side of the parentheses. It does not make any difference. Okay, we're still multiplying a times b plus c. So you would do the same thing, multiply it by each term, and you would have it equal b times a plus c times a. Okay. Same thing with the minus. You would have to distribute it inside the parentheses, and you would end up with BA, and then this time it would be minus CA because there's a minus in here. Okay. So let's look at some other examples. We have 5 times 20 plus 6 in parentheses. This is the same thing as saying 5 times 20 plus 5 times 6. Okay. If you had 9 and then you had 30 minus 2 in parentheses, that would be the same thing as saying 9 times 30. And because this is a minus, we would say minus 9 times 2. Okay, over here we have 20 plus 6 in parentheses times 5. Notice how the 5 is on the other side of my parentheses. That's okay. It's still going to be distributed in. And you would end up with 20 times 5 plus 6 times 5. Okay? Same thing here. Just another example, only this time with a minus sign. 30 minus 2 times 9 is the same thing as 30 times 9 minus 2 times 9. Okay? It helps us be able to break things up a little bit if we think about the distributive property. We could have something like 34 times 102. And that's, I mean, we could work that out if we wrote it out. However, let's think about this logically. If we said, instead, we said 34 times 100 plus 2. I haven't done anything different. All I did was to change my 102 to 100 plus 2. And then what I could do is just say, well, if I use the distributive property, this is 34 times 100 plus 34 times 2, right? And then you could easily say, well, that's 3,400, and this is 68. I can do that in my head. And together, I end up with 3,468, okay? That can help you do some mental math if you just break it down. So let's simplify the following expressions using the distributive property, okay? If we have 2 and then 5x plus 3 in parentheses, we're going to distribute that 2 to both terms inside the parentheses. So 2 times 5 is 10, so 2 times 5x is just 10x. 2 times 3 is 6, so we would end up with 10x plus 6. And because 10x and 6 are not like terms, I leave it like that, and that is completely simplified. If I had the number being multiplied or the factor on the other side of the parentheses, it's okay. We're still going to distribute it in. 1/3 times 3 is just 1. So 1/3 times 3b is just 1b or b, okay? And then you have -2 times 1/3. Well, -2 I can put over 1 times 1/3. And together, if I multiplied across, I would get 2/3 or a -2/3. So I would write -2/3. And because b and 2/3 are not like terms, they're not going to be combined, we're just going to leave it like that. Okay? Over here, we did the same thing. We multiplied the 6 in. 6 times m is just 6m. And 6 times 5 is just 30. So we would have 6m plus 30. Down here, the 2 is going to be multiplied in or distributed into the parentheses. 2 times 3 is 6. Keep in mind that's a minus sign, so 2 times 7 is 14, so 2 times 7t would be 14t, and it would be minus 14t. Okay, look at number 5. Number 5 is a little bit different. Just has a minus sign in front of it. When we are going to look at that, this is called the multiplication property of -1. Basically, or of 1. Basically, if I have a negative sign in front of my parentheses, this is the same thing as a -1, okay? They're not going to write the 1, but we need to know that the factor there is 1, okay? So we would distribute -1 into parentheses. -1 times 2 is a -2, so -1 times 2x is a -2x, okay? -1 times a +1 would be a -1, so I'm going to write -1. I could write plus a -1. I could do this. But when you see it on tests and things like that, it's going to be written like that. Okay? Number 6. Notice that you have two numbers in parentheses. They put this -1 in parentheses mostly because of the negative sign. We're going to distribute that in. Okay? So we have 3 times a -1 minus a -8 times a -1. Okay? 3 times a -1 is -3. However, let's look at this. This is if I were to say it was just 8a times the -1, that would be a -8a, right? So we would have minus a -8a. Well, we know that minus a negative is the same thing as plus a positive. So you would have -3 plus a positive 8a. Okay. Combining like terms. Very important concept number 1. Like terms must have the same variable. So 5y squared and 10y squared are like terms because they both have the y squared. However, 3x squared and 2x are not, because this is x squared and this is x. Those are two different terms, so they would not be considered like terms. Okay, you cannot combine those. So let's look at some examples. If I have 3x squared plus 5x squared, I'm going to take my coefficients and I'm going to add them together. So 3 plus 5 is 8, and then you would keep your x squareds. Okay. Negative 5c plus c. Again, this is a 1c. They're not going to write the 1, but you need to know that it's there. So we would combine our coefficients because we have c. Those are like terms. So we would have negative 5 plus 1, which is a negative 4c. 7y and 6y. We would do 7 plus 6 is 13 and end up with 13y. Again, we have w to the third power on these. Okay, you got to really watch your signs. This is a negative 9 and a negative 3, or a negative 9 minus 3. And so you would end up with a negative 12, the w to the third. If you want to think of it as negative 9 minus 3 being plus a negative 3, if that helps you with your integer rules, you can do that, and you'll still end up with a negative 12 w to the third. You always need to make sure that after you use the distributive property that you combine like terms before you have your completely simplified answer. We've done a lot of writing expressions in class, but this is a little bit of a good review. 3 times the quantity of x minus 5. Quantity is generally going to mean that you're going to need some parentheses. So the quantity of what? X minus 5, and 3 times. So you're going to put the 3 on the outside of the parentheses, and that would be your expression. Negative 2 times the quantity of t plus 7. Again, quantity is going to indicate we're going to need parentheses. And negative 2 times. The product of 14 and the quantity of 8 plus w. The product of 14. Product means multiplication. So we're going to multiply 14 times the quantity of 8 plus w.